Hello and welcome to the Agora Politics Podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Jim Rutt. Jim Rutt is host of the Jim Rutt Show, a podcast series examining cutting-edge thinking in science and technology, as well as former CEO of Network Solutions and former chairman of the Santa Fe Institute for Complex System Sciences. And for our conversation today in particular, he's also the progenitor of Game B, a civilizational level social operating system for human flourishing. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be here.
Thank you for coming on. I think as I told you before this got started, I've been waiting quite a long time to talk to you, and I'm so glad to finally have you here in person and pick your brain a little bit about this concept called Game B. Before we get into the details of it, do you want to just briefly go over, if you will, the origins of the term and sort of how it came to be, put into both your consciousness and the public consciousness for those of us who are aware of it more generally?
Sure. First, I would say I'm not the progenitor of it, though I was one of the group founders. It was clearly a group effort. So let's make sure we give credit to what we refer to as the old gangsters, about a dozen, 15 people that did the work to bring it into being. It was actually a pivot in the kind of venture capital sense. We originally started off in 2012 trying to create a political party called the Emancipation Party. And in fact, our old website is still up because it's got some very interesting things on it at emancipationparty.org. If you want to see what we're up to, go check it out. I will say we were completely incompetent, didn't know what we were doing, and we were not successful. Although, in truth, what we found, we did some, being a lot of ex-business people, I think we had 4 ex-CEOs amongst our 13-person startup team. We did some market research to find out why our recruiting was going so slow or slower than we'd like. And we found that it was popular amongst boomers. It was tolerably popular amongst Gen Xers, but it was completely unacceptable to millennials. And we said, political party completely unacceptable to millennials. There's a really bad idea. So we dug into that a little bit more, and we discovered that even the mere concept of a political party was anathema to millennials, at least in 2012. You might as well have been trying to sell cat shit with powdered sugar on it, right? And so we had a brainstorming session. And the way we did both the Emancipation Party and Game B was actually quite interesting. We flew in a group of people from all around the country and even later in from Canada to a little town in Virginia, Stanton, Virginia. And we would meet for 3 days and brainstorm face to face with social events in the middle, nice dinners, too much liquor some nights. And then we had our online world in Basecamp where we'd continue the discussions. And the combination of face to face and online was magic. For various reasons, I went back and reviewed some of the stuff that's in our online system, which I've archived and kept. It's amazingly good stuff. And I've long said that online by itself produces weak links and, frankly, weak stuff mostly. I mean, just read Twitter, just endless amounts of performative horse shit, basically. And face-to-face is great for building real relationships with people and building strong links. But it's expensive, flying people to, cross country to Virginia every 6 weeks got to be pretty expensive. And but the combination of the two was magical. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind about how Game B came into existence. But anyway, when in terms of the actual emergence of the name and concept Game B, in this session in January 2013, we were saying, what do we do? A guy named Jordan Hall got to the whiteboard and he said, okay, here's a party, but it's too steep. Millennials can't deal with it. Let's think about a broader, much more powerful, in some sense, social movement concept that would be an on-ramp, maybe eventually, to a political party. And we started saying, all right, what is the fundamental diagnosis of our political party, which is that, the world is fucked and it needs to be unfucked, right, basically, in some very major ways. And so he started enumerating on the board, blah, blah, blah. And he said, okay, he just called the status quo Game A and the new idea of the new emerging society Game B. And he called it a new social operating system, et cetera. And we spent a couple hours on it. We went on to talk about other things. Then in the online world between that meeting and the next face-to-face meeting, which was in March, a fellow named Thor Muller had basically reviewed the, was thinking through. He's a real good marketing guy. And he said, you know what? We ought to call this thing Game B, right? Originally, it just been generic names on the whiteboard, right? No significance, no naming, no branding, et cetera. This new thing we're cooking up. And so everybody just said, shit, yeah, that's a great name. And so that's how the name came to be. Even the Game B logo was created by Thor at around that time, maybe a little thereafter. And while we've sparkled it up a little bit, not much, we still use the same logo today. So that's essentially the origin story of how Game B came to be.
Oh, great. And I wanted to then move right into the comparison then, which is implied by the name, which is that, the meme on Twitter would be that, a game B implies the existence of a game A. And so what are the differing characteristics of what we would call game A, which is, one would presume, the phase of civilization that we're in currently that game E is, let's say, in opposition to?
Yeah, I wouldn't say opposition to, and that's a very important note. Game A, and there are different ways to think about the origins of Game A. You can make an argument it goes back to the invention of of agriculture. But my view, and I think the most useful lens of the origins of Game A, is around 1700, where we had the combination of the beginnings of democracy with the Glorious Revolution in Great Britain, where the king was overthrown, new king was imported, king and queen were imported in the Netherlands, but their powers were clearly that of a constitutional monarch with parliament in charge. At the same time, science had been invented, real true modern science. Newton had published his works in the 1660, 1670. There have been a lot of other good scientific work, Robert Boyle, et cetera. And so real science finally emerged right around that time. I mean, it almost emerged back in ancient Greece, but it didn't quite. And it had a second chance, and it happened to gel at that time. And third, modern finance was invented in 1694 with the invention of the Bank of England, which was one of those interesting accidents of history. The King of England needed some money. He'd gotten into trouble fighting too many wars, and actually floated the Bank of England to private investors in return for loans. So the ability to essentially make money by doing loans, classic fractional reserve banking under the supervision of a central bank, in this case a privately owned one, kind of like the Federal Reserve, was invented then. So those were the three antecedents that were necessary for Game A to get rolling. And at the same time, partially driven by science, but actually less so than you would think, technology had been slowly starting to accelerate in the 17th century and then exploded into the 18th century with all the famous things we learned about in fifth grade social studies, the spinning jenny and all the various textile-oriented stuff, the early steam engines, the Newcomen steam engine, which was so inefficient, it was really only useful at the mouths of coal mines for pumping water out of coal mines, because you could have essentially infinite free coal, so you didn't care how inefficient it was. Then James Watt famously massively improved it in the late 18th century. And you combine the growing set of automations around textiles in particular, but also other things, and combine that with steam engines, that really came into the fore around 1800. And things started really taking off. And then science started driving technology. While science was not very important at all to those technologies, it was very important to the next range of technologies. The improvement of the internal combustion engine, the creation of internal combustion engines, the massive improvements in efficiency in the steam engines as we started learning about thermodynamics. And then, of course, the big magical one of the 19th century, electricity, right? Electricity is beyond really crude stuff. You need some science to understand it. You can't just do it by rules of thumb. Though the early telegraph was kind of built by rules of thumb, but anything beyond that, you really do need science. Faraday and folks like that. And of course, electricity just took off extraordinarily rapidly in the late 19th century with the light bulb and the AC and DC electrical generator wars and the electrification of cities, and then electric motors, which actually is an underrated innovation, also came around in the 19th century. So those were essentially what Game A was, and what I at least like to call Game A. And we live in that world today. We live in the world that's directly related to that. And the power of Game A is the world that it found in 1700 was a world where most people lived really poor. They lived in huts with dirt floors. Life expectancy is 35 thereabouts, maybe 40. 50% of children died before they were 5. Most clothing was made at home, and people had 2 sets of clothes, and they stank most of the time. Life was not good, at least looking back from today in 1700. And those 3 things, modern finance, democratic, at least democratic-ish governance, and science with technology, kind of rolled forward and brought humanity an unbelievable distance in 300 years, a little over. Where now the number of people who are desperately in the poor has just been falling like you can't believe, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years. And of course, us people in the West, I was telling someone this morning that, a welfare mother in the United States today lives a lot better than Louis XIV did, right? If for no other reason than modern dentistry. In fact, I went to the dentist today, so I appreciate modern dentistry. However, this is where Game A, it's done miracles. I mean, it's truly done miracles for the capabilities of the human race, the quality of our lives, the leisures we have. You and I'd be out busting our ass in a field someplace probably, rather than shooting the shit on Skype if it were, 1675, frankly, even if it was 1775. So it's done an amazing transformation for the capacity of the human race. However, because it started from such a tiny little base where humanity was a fairly small pimple on the world, we did not have fossil fuels in 1700, right? The first coal mine in the United States was in 1804. Before that, it was water power. And so humanity was in really no real risk to deplete or reach the limits, the carrying capacity of the Earth. The population of the United States in 1776, 2.5 million people, about the size, a little bit less than the population of Kentucky today, right? So again, let's say in the United States, England was, 10 million, something like that, 12 million, 15 million. It was small. So humans were not this massive, dominant thing on the Earth. We weren't tearing the atmosphere apart, et cetera. And we were dirt poor. And so we saw that through the magic of Game A, we could get a lot richer. And then once we solved real medicine, which was remarkably late in the day, about 1870, we did not understand biology at all until 1870. We thought life was magic until Pasteur and some others, and probably medicine was killing more people than it was saving until around 1870, 1880. And of course, the biggest innovations were public health, keeping your sewage out of your water and things of that sort. And so starting around 1870, just this massive population explosion, almost straight up by any historical terms. The population growth started up about 1625, started slowly accelerating through these 17th into the 18th, then it started accelerating the 19th, but late in the 19th, it started going almost straight up. And we now have 8 billion people. And we talked about Ma Nature. I mean, humans not really impinging that much on Ma Nature, say in 1675. Today, humans plus their domestic animals constitute the majority of the large mammal mass on Earth.
Wow.
That's crazy. Here's an even crazier statistic. And then for birds, our domestic poultry are about 80% of the mass of all bird life on Earth. You go, what? That's crazy, right? It was nothing like that when Game A got started. So Game A had no sense of limits, no sense of breaks. It basically was it's this machine that spins, and the Game B analysis is the inter-engine that's driving it today. Is money on money return. Everything is driven around money on money return. that happens at any level of significance, business, politics, even culture today. This goddamn phenomenon of internet influencers. What a corrupt thing that can be. And that's been utterly corrupted by money on money return. So money on money returns driving the machine forward faster and faster and faster. And we're consuming more and more and more. But we are now and most analysts who are really honest will tell you, we are past the long-term carrying capacity of nature, at least at our current level of civilization. And, of course, as our technology has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger, our capacity to do serious and perhaps existential harm to the human race, has come into existence. Again, even say 1775, 1776, we had gunpowder cannons and sailing ships and, muskets and stuff. All right, you could kill a fair number of people, but it took a lot of work to even kill, 1% of the population. Of course, the most dramatic phase change was the development of nuclear weapons in 1945, and then the hydrogen bomb soon thereafter. If we didn't have quite the capacity to kill off the human race, we certainly quickly developed the capacity to destroy advanced civilization. But then we have a lot of other possibilities, things like CRISPR, the ability to edit genes, and it's not that hard. That's the scary thing about it. James Bond's supervillain is building a weaponized version of Ebola in their basement, right? God knows what that might do. And then, guys like Bill Joy have been talking for a long time about the potential existential risks around nanotechnologies. Now, nanotech has taken longer than he thought, and a lot of other people did. But at some point, the idea of little teeny machines that can literally manipulate the structure of matter, one could imagine that going wrong and turning, as Bill Joy talked about, turning the whole world into gray goo. Not so good, right? And then we have our inadvertent technologies that may be destroying our ability to function. In the game B world, we talk a lot about the sense-making crisis and the meaning crisis. And I've been involved with building what we now call the internet since 1980, where I went to work for a company called The Source, the very first consumer online information service. We had chat, we had bulletin boards, we met a precursor of social media in 1981. And we thought we were doing work for the good, and that we would have this wonderful world where all the citizens were well informed, democracy would flourish, everything would be wonderful. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. We were not smart enough, truthfully, complexity science would tell us nobody's smart enough to see how this thing would unfold as it scales. And now that we have billions of people chattering it away at each other on these networks, what has seemed to happen is not the heyday of democracy, but rather some form of nervous breakdown of our social ability to actually have a decent information sphere and to make good political decisions.
And I mean, literal nervous breakdown, as in our nervous systems are overwhelmed by the level of content and disruption that's been brought on by our engagement with these systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And our inability as individuals to process these flows at all accurately, right? We were not designed, I try hard to ration my use of online. And in fact, I'm looking forward here in another month to starting my every year 6-month sabbatical from social media. In particular, I am so fucking tired of Twitter. I'll be so glad to not even look at Twitter for 6 months, because it's just the brain is not designed to process that shit. We're not good at it, right? And Game B believes that, particularly in the infosphere, the answer is to not attempt to be good enough yourself, but to use collective forms of sense making. Work with groups of people to try to make sense of the world, and also to use good hygiene around technology. Almost you might call it neo-Mennonitism or neo-Amish, and say, I'm not going to use social media, or at least I'm not going to use the most pernicious forms of social media, or we'll develop our own forms of social media that aren't specifically designed to have some of the world's smartest computers mine our behavior and then pimp us out to advertisers and use that knowledge to keep us online for the longest period of time possible, and to put us in a psychological state to make us amenable to advertising, which is essentially the business model of Facebook and Twitter. So we, for instance, we are leaving Facebook and we now have our own Game B site, game-b.org, which is a online community of posts and groups and documents and things of that sort, but it is much cooler in its interface, has no machine learning behind it, does not use your behavior against you. And so we think there are some ways to capture most of the good things about social media, but not in a format that's driven by money on money return, escalate, 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 get the yield up, drive the price of ads up, in this crazy cycle that Facebook is doing. So anyway, that's Game A. It has no breaks. It did miraculous things, but it has overstayed its time. And then, of course, the other one that I personally really focus on, the market economies are really good ideas, and I am no socialist, I can tell you that. On the other hand, I'm not a late stage, highly financialized capitalist guy either. I think both are wrong, and this is what is so broken about our politics. Team red and team blue politics is basically hyper-capitalists yelling at socialists, right? Both are wrong. We need something new and different. That has the self-healing and self-learning and self-driving trajectories of market capitalism, but does not have this no breaks, no sense, no social orientation that our current late-stage capitalism has. And one of the I think the signs of true brokenness is scale. In 1776, which is one of the most interesting years in history, two big things: Declaration of Independence, but also Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, the first actual economics book, and one could call it the charter for market capitalism. Though it's not nearly as extreme as some people make it be, but nonetheless. In the United States in 1776, the largest business, at least non-slave business, had 100 employees. It was a shipyard in Philadelphia. You compare the scale of a shipyard with 100 employees building wooden ships by hand to a family farm that might have had 10 people on it, including the farm laborers, et cetera. It's a factor of 10 to 1. And so the power of that shipyard was relatively modest. It was certainly more than a family farm or a corner blacksmith or something, but it was, factor of 10. Today we have companies like Amazon and Walmart that employ millions of people, $100 billion plus in revenue, and you compare that to now we typically don't even have our own small businesses. Mostly we're just individual wage slaves working for some company there. And so the asymmetry in power between Mary Random working as an entry-level position in some business somewhere, and Amazon, it's like totally incommensurable. It's a factor of more than 1 million to 1. In fact, it would be 3 million to 1 approximately in terms of economic power. And that's just a completely different game than what we were playing in 1776. And so Game A, again, has no ability to change course. And so we believe that it all has to be rethought and reinvented to actually work for humanity and get humanity back on a track that, one, works within the carrying capacity of the earth, that operates within the cognitive capacity of humans, upgrades the cognitive capacity of humans in multiple ways. One, raising our children more intelligently, educating them more intelligently, operating socially for trying to make sense of the world and to govern ourselves using better mechanisms than first past the post elections, et cetera, and preserve humanity. Because if we don't do something, humanity is going to crash. I mean, we are past the limits, as I say, in many, many dimensions. And so to try to bring us back into a sustainable world, my goal would be to have humanity reach a sane, sustainable, good way of living by the end of this century. And then from there, we'll operate in an intelligent fashion. And then we'll start to slowly open back up again. And my own personal goal is to go explore the universe. Why the hell not, right? Or at least find it. Well, it's kind of a fork. people say, what is your deep meaning? I don't have any deep meaning. It's, famous for saying, when I hear the word metaphysics, I reach for my pistol, right? And so I don't give two fucks about most of that kind of stuff. But I do see that, if humanity cannot torch itself over the next 80 years or so, in the long term, say 10,000 years, we can probe the universe, see if there's anybody else out there. And there's, more and more reason to believe maybe there isn't, right? This is a great famous argument. I talk about it in my podcast all the time, the Fermi Paradox. I've had experts on the topic and nobody knows. I mean, there's a bunch of arguments that say maybe we're by ourselves, and other ones say maybe there's a whole bunch of them out there, and then there's other analysis that say there's just a few. But if it turns out that we're alone, let's say at least in our galaxy, then the burden on humanity to preserve itself becomes even greater. Because I would say we have an opportunity to bring the universe to life. And I would say life is more interesting than non-life. And for humanity to blow its chance to bring the universe to life would be a gigantic sin. And so that's at least my personal, Jim Rutt's, reason for doing this Game B thing, is to preserve our, to morph our civilization into something that is sane, where individuals are sovereign, live beautiful lives, but at low impact on the earth. But we are not hippies looking to live in mud huts and fall back away from advanced technology, but we use technologies for the good of humanity, not in this constant chasing of money on money return. So that was kind of rambling, and I've done a better job of presenting it, but I think that gives people a reasonable idea what we're up to.
Yeah, that certainly gives me a lot of materials to start working with here in these next follow-up questions I have. I wanted to first stay a little bit focused still on Game A here. So, this money on money return concept, this idea that Game A is sort of the mechanistically driven. It seems to me that you're focusing more on this, the engine of capitalism, and it's sort of blindingly driving forward without really consideration for what it's doing or how it's affecting people. People like to hate on Amazon, for example, because it's this massive corporation and, they've got anti-competitive practices and whatever your criticisms of Amazon might be. But we can all blame Jeff Bezos for that if we'd like. But at the end of the day, the thing is that no one's really running Amazon. An organization that large is sort of just running itself. You've got all these nodes of people that are, involved in the Amazon network that are, doing their own things and have their own self-interests at heart. And even the guy at the top has somewhat limited control over, what is actually happening with an organization that large. It's almost more like an organism, and it's sort of like all the little people working for Amazon are more like mitochondria inside of it, rather than the agents of change that we or they might imagine that they are. And so this is a classic critique of capitalism, that it sort of creates these very inhuman machines that kind of just drive forward. Decentralization is a core principle of Game B, and obviously has become much more popular in general, especially with the rise of let's say blockchain technology, cryptographic ledgers, distributed databases, essentially. Do you see cryptocurrencies and sort of the crypto space playing a role in sort of deleveraging the centralized financial mechanism that's driving Game A?
I think it can be. Though again, I've been following let's call it blockchain-style cryptocurrency since about 2 months after Satoshi published his famous paper. I smacked myself in the head and said, "God damn it, Rutt, why didn't you think of that?" It's not really that hard, but it's brilliant. On the other hand, I do think that we've gotten way too over-invested in that one narrow definition of new forms of communication and signaling. And so I think that new forms of coordination signaling are certainly part of what's going to make Game B come into emergence and allow it to cohere. But whether it's cryptocurrency based on the current approaches, I have my doubts, right? They have lots and lots of functional problems. They have some what I would call deep moral problems. In fact, Bitcoin is probably exactly wrong on almost every dimension to be what we'd actually want in the future. I mean, it was modeled on gold and has all the vices of gold and some new ones. For instance, what is the actual single use case for Bitcoin where it's superior to all other methods of doing business? Ransomware. It's the only one, right? That I could argue. Now, Ethereum takes us to a new place. Now, I think Ethereum is a very interesting opening into the world of the future. And the thing that distinguishes Ethereum from Bitcoin is the ability to write relatively complete contracts in a programming language, which allow you to do a fair amount in the blockchain and on this distributed ledger. And I think that is quite interesting. But on Ethereum, it's got a horrible architecture. It doesn't scale. They talk about all this shit they're going to do to make it scale. It ain't going to happen. We now have some third generation projects like Cardano and Holochain, which are more scalable, but still not as scalable as you might hope. And also have better semantics in terms of what you can actually implement on them than Ethereum does. So my thinking is that Bitcoin was a rough prototype with a whole bunch of bad design decisions, but hey, got the ball rolling. Ethereum still has some really bad design decisions in it, like proof of work. What an idiot idea that is in terms of anything that's scalable. But it added the very, very cool idea of contracts. Next generation ones are more scalable and have fuller contracts, and particularly in the case of Cardano, much better security. And so they're moving in the right direction. On the other hand, I think that there's some ideology in the current crypto world which keeps it from being more successful, which is a cultural demand for radical trustlessness in the architectures. Now, of course, it's not actually true, because it turns out that the core developers have control at some level, right? And there's been lots of politics. And what do you do when there's a big heist? Do you fork it or not to roll back the heist, et cetera? I will say Bitcoin has always remained true to itself. It's the least corrupted by its mafia, essentially. But most of the rest of them are corrupted to a greater or lesser degree by their mafias. And so you're not going to have 100% trustlessness anyway. And so if you back off from radical trustlessness even a little bit and use, for instance, federated trust, you can increase the performance of distributed ledgers by a factor of 6 orders of magnitude, which is quite remarkable. And now you start talking about scales that can approach that of Visa or MasterCard, and yet still operate with all the advantages of distributed cryptographically secure ledgers. And I suspect that will be where blockchain gets out of this prototyping phase. This is where I would describe it being today, and breaks through into something truly interesting when the ideology of the current crypto people are kind of bypassed by something that doesn't require radical 100% trustlessness, but scales way better. Because in reality, we have to trust something in life. Trustlessness is a false comfort in many ways. Because if nothing else, even Bitcoin trusts the ongoing operation of an electrical grid. What happens if the grid goes down in an EMP attack or a massive solar flare? Whoops! All them Bitcoin. I have a couple of fractions of Bitcoin and an old computer sitting in my barn. I have no idea if those computers even still work, but it's probably $10,000 worth of Bitcoin sitting on them. But if the computer networks go down, what the hell are you going to do then? So anyway, that's I think there's amazingly interesting thinking. It's opened up a big space. I think distributed finance, DeFi, is really interesting. Frankly, more interesting than crypto itself in its current manifestations. And so all these things are well worth working on, doing experiments on, et cetera. But keep in mind that these are basically just prototypes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they're definitely not at the stage yet where they can scale to the level that we would need them to function as sort of a unit of exchange, or maybe even a store of value, you could argue.
And stores of, by the way, this is real important. Stores of value are bad ideas, right? You don't want stores of value. And this is where people's thinking is all fucked up, right? Bitcoin is like gold, right? If instead of taking what is your savings, right? The source of investment is savings, basically, theoretically, it's what you have produced that you did not consume.
Mm-hmm.
And to put it in gold is no different than taking $100 bills and put it in your mattress, right? You essentially are not investing your savings back into the world. So I would say Bitcoin as a store of value is a grossly antisocial, indeed sociopathic thing to do. What you should be doing is invest your savings in productive assets, right? Mm-hmm. And putting it in the bank is kind of an intermediate case, because the bank will use that as use its famous multiplier effect, and will use it to make loans to people to grow their businesses, et cetera. But a lot of that loans will also be for consumer capitalism, which is not so good. But better to take your savings and invest it in a business, start a business yourself, invest it with somebody you know who's starting a business, pool with other people to start a business, et cetera. So this idea of store of value, I think, is a pernicious one that people should get out of their head. You do not want to put your saved production, the production you did not consume, into a sterile store of value. You want to make sure it gets to work, creating more stuff for the world.
Well, so I'm a big fan of Peter Thiel, and he says that one of the problems with our current system, or with the allocation of money, is that people don't know where to put it. And so when you talk about, I think this is part of the reason why there's such an urge to have some sort of store of value. You know, the Bitcoin hodlers are, you know, many of them are basically treating it like, well, I don't have anything better to do with this money other than put it into these coins and hope that they go to the moon. And you know, and Thiel would say, look, that's actually a symptom of the broader economy in general. You know, as I'm sure you understand, we've had stagnating growth since basically the mid 1970s. Real growth has slowed down. And so one of the questions there is, you know, if it's true that your money would be better spent being invested in productive assets, how do we get the engine of productivity going again in the real economy? Because I think one of the crucial criticisms that Bitcoiners and people that are long on crypto in general have is that part of the financial system that we've inherited is what's causing the slowdown in growth, the fact that we have these fiat systems that we're working within. So how do you think about sort of rebooting growth in a real way?
By the way, I don't entirely buy Thiel's argument. I think he makes the mistake of mistaking the macrosphere for growth, right? You know, one of the things he talks about is, oh, what are the new home appliances? You know, nothing's happened since 1975 except maybe the microwave oven, right? On the other hand, everything in our house is a shitload better than it used to be. You know, you're probably too young. I remember when TVs had tubes in them, were highly unreliable, flickered all the time. Now I got this beautiful flat screen display that's absolutely perfect, never has any problems, etc. You know, I got everything's a whole lot better. Everything's gotten smarter, and what I call that is growth into the microcosm. And by the way, this swings both ways. You know, people claim they're anti-growth, right? I go, don't use that language, please, even though I'm somewhat sympathetic to your thinking. Instead, say that you are opposed to growth in the macrosphere, right? Stuff that uses more matter, that puts a bigger burden on Mother Nature. But having higher capacity chips, for instance, is a great way to grow into the microsphere. And an unbelievable amount of that's happened since 1975. So Peter Thiel is overly fixated on a 1925 view of what growth actually is. So I think that's important. You know, there's a lot going on in the world that doesn't show up in terms of gross stuff, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot that goes on, for example, that doesn't directly show up in the GDP numbers, let's say. And one of the core concepts of Game B that I'd like to get into is this concept of human flourishing, which I think you would say that, well, you could say it yourself, actually, but I would say that there are going to be many different definitions of human flourishing. And so if one of the core principles of Game B is to maximize or potentiate human flourishing, we have to sort of get an idea about at least for various kinds of Game B projects, what our conception of human flourishing might be. You know, there's a lot of conversation, for example, around the fact that childcare or home care or just general care is not properly, they'll say it's not properly compensated in the market, right? This is a very common argument, especially in more socially, socially democratic or socially justice-oriented circles. They'll say, well, look, there's all this labor that happens in the home and elsewhere, childcare, care for elders, care for sick people, and we don't really have any good mechanisms for compensating that care properly. Do you think that framing it in those terms of proper compensation is the wrong way to think about it? Because certainly if we're thinking about human flourishing, humans caring for other humans would be a big part of that.
Absolutely. I think that's a piece of it for sure. I'm going to address a couple different parts of your question. One, we do believe in Game B in pluralism. We don't believe there is one way for human flourishing. For example, in fact, the current epoch of Game B, we call it the very beginnings of Proto B, where actual settlements on the ground are starting to be built. 2 projects have actually bought their land. There's another one that's looking to buy some land soon. And we have some fairly macro definitions of what a Proto B is. On the other hand, we expect each one to be quite different. Some will be essentially voluntarily socialist, like an Israeli kibbutz, right? An Israeli kibbutz is very interesting, particularly along the lines you talked about compensated and uncompensated work. In an Israeli kibbutz, people that do the cooking, that do the buying of food, that do the laundry, that clean the houses, they're all paid the same as the lawyer and the electrical engineer who work on their high-tech businesses, at least in those kibbutzes that keep to the old original kibbutz style, which is about 20% of them. And so there's a mechanism that one could essentially fully compensate all that service work at exactly equality with all other kinds of work. Now, since 1977, the kibbutzes have fragmented into various directions, and some of them now have differential pay for differential jobs, but all the social work, the work of society, is still paid, it's still built in. So when you become a member of a kibbutz, babysitting is built in. You have childcare, right? You don't have to go arrange it somehow. Part of the social contract of living in a kibbutz is that there will be childcare, there will be education. There will be some recreational things like swimming pools and tennis courts. They have their own private parks. It's really quite amazing. And, I think that's a quite interesting model for at least a number of people who want to go further down the road to Game B in those ways and doing exactly as you say, build in the fact that the work of holding our society together is real work and should be compensated like all other work.
Mm-hmm. And given the, I guess, so you hinted there at, sort of getting out of Game A, right? And moving into these sort of more experimental, I'll just say communities. They're not quite communes, although maybe they would manifest in some variants.
Some of them might be.
Yeah.
Some might be. Others are not. And that's the interesting thing about the Proto B exploration is that, I would guess there'll be 20 to 50 Proto Bs spun up in the next 4 or 5 years. And each one will be different in terms of its ethos and its constitution. I expect, some of them will be radically egalitarian. Others will be radically libertarian and will kind of look like, a real estate subdivision with a really powerful community center and organization around it. And there'll be a whole bunch in between. Further, again, one of the core concepts of Game B, how do we get from these little bitsy experimental Game Bs to actually winning, is that we strongly encourage Proto Bs and anybody playing Game B to figure out how to parasitize Game A, right? It's our hypothesis, not yet proven, that our decentralized, non-hierarchical, network-centric ways of doing things, at least in some domains, will actually be able to outcompete Game A at its own thing. And so some of the third Proto B looks to be focused on digital knowledge workers who don't want to live in the big city anymore, but still will have ways to make big city earnings, right? And the idea of a proto B also is that it's inexpensive to live there because it's not about status through possessions. Houses will be small. People will just wear ordinary clothes. People will be thought to be complete ass clowns if they drive up in a Mercedes. The cultures will be, you live just fine on 60,000 a year, right? Maybe less. And yet you're still making 200,000 a year because we're running kick-ass businesses that are out competing, game A and things like data science and machine learning and certain areas of robotics, et cetera. And all that, savings, basically the work that is not consumed can then be plowed back into building more game B. Use that as the seed capital to spin up more and more and more proto Bs. And as you know, if you can get the exponential over 1, sooner or later you win. So so parasitizing game A. And at the same time, building places that are much better to live. When people see what we have done, come visit, because tourism will also be part of a lot of the early proto Bs, and say, do I want to live in New York City and deal with or even worse, San Francisco, and deal with, shit on the streets and $1 million, 1,000 square foot condos and, ridiculous restaurants that, everything just oversaturated, overdone, or in a place where all my social needs are baked into the community. It might take me 15 or 20 hours of work a week to maintain. If that's all I want to do, if I want to work more than that, I can provide a surplus to help grow game B. And we believe that more and more people, particularly young people, because young people are seeing through game A, right? That was part of the reason they rejected our Emancipation Party, because it wasn't different enough from game A, right? It still assumed game A. That was our mistake. When they
I would say it wasn't deep enough.
It was not deep enough. Absolutely. It was clever, superficial. And there were some cool things. We had a monetary system. We had all kinds of radical shit. But it wasn't deep enough. You're exactly right. And when they see a flourishing game B community, it doesn't have to be all of them, 1 or 2% is all you need initially, right? The classic innovator types say, I would much rather live in this beautiful proto B in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And oh, by the way, have a sales force that's selling my technical services into corporate America at $300 an hour. And in the meantime, I only really need about $30 an hour to live here. And the rest is about building game B for the world. And we think as that starts to scale, we will start pulling people over. And of course, the interesting thing about a hypothesis, not proven, is that we will be pulling the smartest, most interesting people over, because they're the ones that are going to get it first. And if you pull all the brains out of game A, guess what? Game A starts to collapse.
Yeah. Well, I would say something about that too. There is a problem in game A about sort of the worst aspects of our society attracting the smartest minds by just paying them exorbitant amounts, like finance, for example. But I wanted to just make a note here about my friend Jason Snyder. So my friend Jason Snyder and I don't know if you know of him, maybe you do.
Oh yeah, I've chatted with him. He's a cool dude. He lives down North Carolina. He's doing some hardcore homesteading. Yeah, we chat from time to time, mostly an email. But yeah, I definitely love what Jason's up to.
Yeah, so he's doing the whole thing, and we had a conversation about homesteading actually at the beginning of this year. And he's been nudging me to like come out to I think he's in North Carolina now. Come out to North Carolina, get a plot of land, and we'll set up a community. And I asked him about this exact problem of, well, how do you go from how do you make the transition from game A into game B? How do you begin to how do you begin this parasitization problem? Because one of the issues that especially a lot of young people have who are still, for example, like myself, in need of some capital to get going, is that a lot of the jobs, for example, are still in the cities. And in my case, and as well as for many of the other younger millennials, as well as a lot of the Gen Z that are now coming up, I have a lot of debt, right, from my college education, and from just the sort of systems that I was enmeshed in. And so I'm going to have to get out of that debt in order to even begin to start establishing some sovereignty about, where I live and, vocationally, et cetera. And it's going to be hard. I'll just say that. It's going to be hard for most people that aren't, extremely well positioned for whatever reason. And so how do you think about this issue of vocation? Because you do need to do something to make money. I know you've talked about remote jobs. When Jason and I were talking, he was saying also that, I was pushing on him that, look, one of the bigger problems that you're going to have trying to establish these communities is you're not really breaking away from the global supply chain. And so I would assume that you would say that, well, part of parasitizing Game A is just using the established structures and networks that Game A has, and basically gathering those resources like what you're talking about from playing Game A well, adeptly, and then funneling them into Game B projects, and then slowly trying to get more independent from there. How do you think about individuals that are trying to make that transition?
Yeah, excellent question. And this is something I spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about it. And I would say an awful lot of the people in Game B are thinking about high tech, programmers and machine learning dudes and all this. But I also stress the fact that we need to make places for people at every level of occupation in Game B. And so, for instance, I've laid out the idea of a Game B auto repair business. One of the most corrupt businesses in the world is the goddamn auto repair business. Suppose we were to brand Game B auto repair, and that there are a number of proto-Bs that had as their business an auto repair business, right? And it had a reputation for actually being honest and cost effective and, and qualified people doing the work and all that sort of stuff. That could be one of several businesses. In the same way, the kibbutzes, the Israeli kibbutzes that are successful, often have 5 or 6 different outwardly facing businesses that they have created. And it could be auto repair. It could be charter schools in those jurisdictions that offer, charter school laws that are reasonable, which unfortunately Virginia is not one of them. But New Mexico for sure is, where I used to live. And, charter schools can provide a number of good paying jobs, for people in the community, and then bring in, children from outside the community. Not only do our own kids get a good Game B education, but we also offer that as a product, essentially, to the community. And I'm reimbursed by the state. What a wonderful way to parasitize Game A. And, teachers now are making pretty good money, and my hometown, I looked it up the other day, a teacher with 20 years experience making over $100,000 a year. Amazing, right? In Virginia, it's not quite that high, but still it's a good, solid middle-class job if you're not sucked into the world of status through possessions, right? If you don't believe you need to have a vacation in Acapulco or whatever the hell the hot place is. What's the thing down at the end of
it's like Cabo and
Cabo. That's it. That's the one thing. But it's got a trendy ass place for goof asses that don't understand what the fuck is going on, like to go and party. And you don't need that shit. That's just ridiculous, right? And you don't need a car, right? A community of 150 people probably get along fine with 50 cars, right? And maybe even less than that. And if you just rethink how one lives, you grow most of your food on your own plot of land, and a certain percentage of the people who live there, they work the farm, right? And they're paid just like, socially, just like the child care people and the people that do the cooking and the laundry. So you have to think outside the box of just digital nomads and include other ways of making a living. And it'll vary by where you are. It's one of the reasons I'm targeting the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. There's lots of industry over there, lots of logistics. There's 3 big universities. So there's lots, and the universities have many jobs, not just professorial jobs that pay well. And so I would expect initially many of the people that live on a Shenandoah Valley, Virginia proto-B will just be working in the local industries, working at the universities, then start up a business or two, see if they work. Some will be digital nomads who can just do their thing anywhere. And it'll gradually work itself into more and more focus. So again, I think one of the most important things is that it's got to be an experimental and exploratory mindset. So now to your next question, this is an interesting one, is, the people who, come in with the debt. I will say we don't have a great answer to that. I would say in things I've written, like in A Journey to Game B, which is probably my most complete thinking so far on Game B's, Proto B's. It's on Medium. It's called A Journey to Game B by Jim Rutt. I do suggest that people got to figure that one out on their own before they come into a Proto B, that you don't want your Game A debts following you. And so put yourself on a plan, pay off your goddamn debts, right? Even if it means living on ramen and having roommates for 4 more years, right? Now, I know for some people that's impossible. People have got $200,000 worth of debt. I don't know what the fuck they do. They're just well and truly fucked, right? I think the average amount of student debt these days is about 40 grand.
Yeah.
And realistically, you could pay off 40 grand in 4 to 10 years if you really focused on that as a priority. It's also possible, and again, I'm going to have to do some thinking about this, there might be a way to get investors to stake you in some fashion, right? Which, at the level of 40,000, it's feasible. At the level of 200,000, it's probably not feasible. Someone that's got a degree in medieval history and $200,000 in debt, frankly, they're probably stuck in Game A, right? At least until Game B gets far enough along to do our real game changer, which is the debt jubilee.
Yes. I've talked about that in previous episodes, and
I
don't think it's happening anytime soon. But
look at the emancipationparty.org, and we lay out a magical trick how we can cause the jubilee to happen relatively rapidly. I'm not going to say any more about it because it's a very dangerous idea, and if it got into the wrong hands, that would not be good. But eventually, that's how we free the rest of the debt slaves to bring them on board. Many of them will be able to have jobs that pay well enough to service their debt. There may be a way to get investors to stake them to free them from their debt. If they agree to participate, let's say, in the social work of the community for 5 years, in the same way, dentists and stuff will agree to practice dentistry in Appalachia for 5 years in return for forgiveness of their dental school loans. A friend of mine did that, and it worked out great. But then finally, those who are deeply entrenched in debt slavery will have to wait for the debt jubilee.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, you brought up, it's funny to me that you brought up auto mechanic or auto repair, because I've got this book here, Shop Class is Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford, who not quite similar to me, but he was also a political science, political theory guy who actually, made it all the way to the top. He was working at a DC think tank and decided to leave that life and just go work on motorcycles. And it's sort of a, Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance type 2.0 situation. But he wrote this book about it, and this whole book about him deciding to do that and why he wanted to sort of have a more down-to-earth, community-based vocation. It was very, very influential on me when I was younger, when I came upon it, and also is very similar to a lot of the things that we're talking about here today. I wanted to ask you then a little bit about this concept of status. So you've talked a lot in your writings and in your other talks about these sort of status traps that we get caught up in Game A. And one of the criticisms that I just keep running into that I wanted to ask you about is the fact that, status hierarchies are really, really baked into humans. I would claim that they're part of our human nature to be concerned with our status within the group, to want to achieve status. Obviously, if you're a younger guy and you're still looking to find a long-term mate, you want status because that's what's going to get you a better partner. And so I think that's going to be one of the hardest hurdles to sort of get around, is even inside of these proto-B communities. How do you deal with the fact that there is this drive in human beings, and in mammals more generally, for status, especially social ones?
Now, there's a book you've got to read because this is a very important question. It's called Hierarchy in the Forest by a cultural anthropologist named Chris Boehm, Boehm. He's been affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute. I think he's pretty much retired now. The book should have been called Anti-Hierarchy in the Forest, because essentially what he lays out is that you're absolutely right. If we look at our genealogy, we're closely related to two rather hierarchical species, bonobos and chimps. They're hierarchical in different ways, but they're both rather hierarchical. Humans in their forager, also known as hunter-gatherer epochs, however, managed to build egalitarian societies without much hierarchy. And they developed a whole social operating system to do that, which was when people tried to assert themselves as boss mans or big men or whatever. First, people ignored them. Then they laughed at them. Then they exiled them. And if they kept coming back, they killed them. And they essentially had built a immune system against strong hierarchy. And it was quite flat, and famously up to about the Dunbar number of about 150 people. And that's one of the reasons why we suggest that proto-bee communities be around that order, because you don't really need very much hierarchy. You need a little, and a lot of it can be rotational. Again, like the Israeli kibbutz, they will often time limit your time in any position of authority to 3 years. At 3 years, you got to go out, somebody else got to come in. And it may not be optimal in terms of getting the best talent in the job, but their belief is that the benefits of not building in hierarchy more than make up in terms of quality of life. And again, that's what we're after, right? About quality of life. We don't really want that fucking Mercedes. I mean, goddamn fucking Mercedes. I used to have a Mercedes way back yonder, and then you worry about somebody dinging the fucking door, or stealing it, or, getting a flat. If you have a goddamn repair on a Mercedes, it costs you out the ass. Unbelievable what it costs, right? Fuck all them things, right? Good old 10-year-old Nissan Tacoma is better in almost every possible dimension, right, than a fucking Mercedes, right? Or even worse, a Porsche, right? Porsche's hell of a good time to drive, but it's just a ridiculous thing that we get sucked into. But nonetheless, people are looking for ways to distinguish themselves, right?
Yes.
I wouldn't call it hierarchy, but it's called ways to distinguish themselves. And what we have suggested, or I know I've suggested, and other people in the community have suggested as well, is that things like self-actualization is a way to distinguish yourself. And people are going to vary on that. Not only are they going to vary on how much they self-actualize, but the dimensions in which they self-actualize. Let's say you're an amazingly good guitar player who can riff and jam. My buddies that are guitar players all got a lot of booty, right? Even if they got no money, right? Mm-hmm. The ladies like the musicians. So there's a way to have yourself be distinguished, but in a non-hierarchical fashion. The other one I like to lay out, because, hey, I'm a jovial kind of dude, is conviviality. People that know how to have a good time, know how to throw a good party, know how to be a host, right? And I can tell you, some people also do okay with the members of the opposite sex. So there's an example of distinguishing yourself with a superpower. Here's a person that's a great convivialist, a guitar player, a storyteller, a shaman, a person that helps people meditate. There's just so many ways that you can distinguish yourself that are not hierarchical. And particularly and the only reason you have why the hierarchy is so attractive in our world is because you get paid more. Oh, no, you go up the hierarchy, make more money, buy more bling, more shiny shit, get that Mercedes, worry about somebody keying it, right? It's a goddamn trap. And so we don't believe that you need hierarchy. At least not persistent hierarchy. And the other idea we've stolen from Chris Boehm, but of course other people come up with this as well independently of us and him, is what we call role-based leadership rather than position-based leadership. For instance, in the Dunbar number size forager communities, the woman who's the expert at raising tubers is the person everybody goes to when they need advice or direction on farming, right? And the forager people did small-scale local agriculture as well. The dude that just has that sixth sense for where the game is, he's the hunting master, right? But only as long as he is the best. When somebody else comes along that's better at that, he stops being the hunting master and somebody else is the hunting master and somebody else is the war master. Contrary to some of the hippie shit, forager people fought all the time. The male death rate from violence in hunter-gatherer worlds was somewhere between 10 and 40%. This was not a pacifistic world in most cases. There were a few specific ecosystems that could allow for pacifistic world, but in general, there was contention between the groups. So, position-based leadership rather than a box on a chart-based leadership, something of course we're going to have, right? You want someone who's good at something to take on that work. It doesn't mean they get paid more necessarily. It doesn't mean that their status of being a place higher up on the box chart means they're a better or more important person, but it does mean that they're distinguished in a certain way, right? So if you want to be the mate of or the friend of somebody who's the garden woman versus the warrior dude, or the any of these other, the musicians, the shamans, etc. Lots of different ways for people to distinguish themselves. In fact, almost an infinite number of ways. So I think you think about distinguishing yourself, which everybody wants to do, or not everybody. There's a lot of people who don't give a shit about that. But a lot of people want to distinguish themselves. There's lots of ways to distinguish yourself that are much richer and they give much more to the community than climbing the corporate ladder and then figuring out how to fuck people over and maximize the amount of money you make.
Yeah. Well, so the word that I would be that I'm sort of toying with here is competence-based leadership, right? With this sort of specialization, right? Yeah.
The same thing as role-based leadership. The same thing.
So let's get into governance then on sort of the fractal level here. You've made references in prior conversations about Game B to this concept of liquid democracy. Do you think that a liquid democracy or even democracy itself would be necessarily the primary form of governance in these, let's say, social ecosystems?
This is a very good question. The answer is we don't know. I would say that I doubt that democracy is the right way to run a community of 150 people. Mm-hmm. There may be sometimes some special issues for which democracy is the last resort. But in general, in a community of 150 people, are going to want to operate by consensus mostly, and that's how the Israeli kibbutzes have done it. And one of our Game B folks, Forrest Landry, has come up with a very interesting hybrid, which I love. And I got to say, I've taken his idea and I've extended it beyond which he is comfortable with. So this is this is from his core idea, small group practice, and I have hijacked it and bent it beyond what he's willing to stand behind. So don't blame Forrest for this. But take a small group practice idea, which is you first go into consensus. Let's say you want to figure out how to manage the farm. Say we have a 200-acre proto-B, of which about 100 acres is farmland. And so we go into consensus, basically everybody one person, and you need essentially all agreement, though we've also developed a Game B concept called rough consensus, that if consensus won't happen after enough time, then we can go to a vote, but it's got to be like 75 or 80%, super majority as a rough consensus. And the job of the consensus is to build the executive. So is to define what the executive in charge of agriculture does, what are their responsibilities, how are they funded, and who are the people that are appointed into those positions, and then how do they replicate themselves? Maybe if one of them quits, the survivors just appoint another one. That would be the classic way it happens in the not-for-profit world. But whatever mechanism, the consensus designs the executive. The executive then goes and just does its thing, typically would have reporting requirements back to the community as a whole. And they are not subject to oversight. They're not subject to votes. The decision of what to plant each year never comes before the general meeting, et cetera. But the general meeting, the consensus, has one power and one power only, which is what I call to press the red button and dissolve the executive, which then pushes the problem back to the consensus organization with the charge to define a new executive. And you didn't like the way that one was working, and truthfully, it might be as small as just changing the personnel. Maybe we're happy with the structure, but it turns out the three people running it are all assholes for whatever reason. We didn't know it at the time, so we press the red button. We say, all right, we like the structure, but we're appointing these three people to be the new leaders of the agriculture executive. And then the agriculture executive goes off and does its thing with regular reporting, but no democratic oversight. That's an example that I think could work. And I think it's real important to say could, because all these ideas, including my pet idea of liquid democracy, are unproven at scale and would be dangerous to assume that they would work. And again, this is a very big game B thing. Like we call it epistemic humility or modesty, is don't think you're smarter than you actually are. When it comes to dicking with complex adaptive systems, our ability to predict what will happen with any significant intervention is a hell of a lot smaller than we think it is. So take relatively small steps, be empirical, be prepared to back off or modify if you find that what you're doing doesn't work.
Yeah, well, so this is an interesting point of contention here, is the sort of the difference between the emphasis on design versus iteration. So, you know, sort of the hot thing, especially if you're more of like a tech-minded Silicon Valley type, is, well, we don't need to actually plan anything out. We don't even need to know what our product is going to be. We're going to sort of find product market fit as we go along, and everything is just about increasing the rate of iteration. Again, hearkening back to Thiel, just because he's been sort of an influence on me intellectually over the last few years, he sort of pushes against this in the opposite direction. He says, well, there's too much emphasis on sort of blind iteration. You need actually more careful, thoughtful, thorough planning and directedness, which would be sort of more in the design space. How do you think about sort of the trade-offs between iterating and design?
Very good question. One of my favorite topics. Let me, if you don't mind, I'm gonna take a break here and get a can of
sure.
something to drink. Yeah, this is a very important question, and the meta answer is they're all talking about the wrong thing, because there are times when you want one and times when you want the other. I've been involved with 20 early stage companies as either a founder, actually an employee for only one of those. That I learned it's a hell of a lot better to be with something besides an employee. Founder, investor, advisor, member of the board of directors. So I've seen lots of these things up front, and I know of lots of other ones. And we've actually looked at this at the Santa Fe Institute to some degree. And there's actually a mathematical theorem that's important here called the no free lunch theorem, which basically says there is no one right way to search, right? And a business is a search algorithm on the coevolutionary fitness landscape of other businesses that are out there, essentially, right? That's all a business is, a search algorithm, right? And it's important to think about it that way. And the no free lunch theorem says there is no one algorithm that's optimal. And this is clearly the case in business. I can give you, two different, completely different examples of companies I've been involved with. One is a relatively lightweight app for helping you improve your sovereignty in the game B sense. That helps you lower the gap between intention and action. And truthfully, while there's some very interesting back-end things going on, the most important part is that it's really easy to use and and it also has social built into it. And it's really easy to use, and that the social actually does what it's supposed to do. This is a perfect example for a perfect case for fast iteration, learning and constantly changing, and either we'll figure it out or we won't. There's no way to figure this out in advance. Other extreme, another one of my companies that we ended up selling, had a nice successful effort, was software for designing computer chips. In particular, this last one we did two companies for computer chip design, was to optimize chip design for manufacturability. Because we're now getting down to the level of these traces on the chips, 4 nanometers, now they're going to 2, where quantum mechanics actually become a significant factor in what happens on the chip. And there's 2 problems. One, does it work at all? But then if you can solve that problem, which we could not solve, that was not in our charter, was all right, now you got one that works, but its yield is only going to be 50 or 60% because it's dealing with all this quantum parasitism. Can you do something to move 50 or 60% good chip yield to 80 or 90% good chip yield? Turns out there are some things you can do using some very advanced technologies, kind of at the maniac edge. I'm not going to. I guess I could tell now since we sold the company. But anyway, it doesn't matter. We assume it's magic shit that took us 6 or 7 years to get right. This was research, planning, listening to customers, yes, but mostly just working really hard to figure out how to solve this world-class fucking problem. And the other antithesis of, sort of a light social or ease of use and getting the social right is important. And so there's no one answer to it. Peter Thiel's absolutely right. If you want to build Palantir, you can't do it in 1 week agile sprints. On the other hand, someone that does a 1 year plan using 1970 style waterfall design for a lightweight social app is a fucking idiot, right? So I say nobody is correct who says there's one way to think about it. All depends on the problem domain. Mm-hmm. So it's essentially to take it up a level. Where are you in the co-evolutionary fitness landscape? What is the nature of the problem that's actually of economic value? And is it a problem that is for which rapid but shallow iteration is the right thing to do? Or is it something that 5 years of ball busting work? Oh, another company that I haven't actually taken a formal position with, but might, quantum computing. Mm-hmm. Again, this is deep think. It'll be 4 years before they even have a prototype, right? This is not about, agile and all. This is deep thinking. So there ain't no right answer. Don't believe anybody who says there is. Look at the co-evolutionary fitness landscape where you're at. What's the most important driver of the business you're trying to do, and what kind of goals, structure, and methods will help you solve that one or two hard problems that will make or break this company in that co-evolutionary fitness landscape.
Yeah, so really about being extremely keyed into, fitness as such, and making it as closely aligned with the proper description of the problem actually becomes actually way more important.
Yeah, and understanding, because any business that's likely to succeed is trying to solve no more than two problems, right? Real problems. There's a lot of recombination, getting things right. But in fact, I prefer one hard problem. Solve one hard problem and are reasonably intelligent on your recombination. And assuming the problem is one of actual economic value, you will be successful if you have a good team.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask, while we're still on the topic of entrepreneurship, if there are some problems that can't be solved in this sort of Dunbar level, group size, maybe they take larger human scales of mobilization in order to get fixed. I'm thinking, what you're talking about there with the microchip technology probably involves, orders of magnitudes of complicated, human machinery that sort of has to come together to make something like that happen. Do you think that as something that is compatible with these Game B setups? Are you imagining sort of networks of Game B proto communities that sort of horizontally communicate?
Yeah, horizontally, vertically, mesh networked. Let's take a chip manufacturing plant, because that's a really interesting example. There's no way to make, that we know of today, to make 2 nanometer chips other than in a $10 billion plant, right? And one could imagine a $10 billion plant owned by Game B with hundreds of proto Bs around it, right? And a bunch of, maybe a quarter of the people on each proto B works at the plant, right? Nothing wrong with that. Perfectly reasonable. Now, in terms of other kinds of problems, let's say we wanted to build a competitor, a better Facebook, right? Nothing like Facebook. Right? Well, it can start small. It's actually not that hard a technical problem. As it grows, it's going to need thousands and tens of thousands of people working at it. And the organization, the Game B venture, can have filaments that reach out all over the place into all the other proto Bs, and oh, by the way, into Game A. Nothing that says that a Game B venture has to only employ Game B people, right? And so, one should not think that a Game B venture overlays one-to-one on a proto B, because there's many, many interesting problems for which, and we say 150 people, frankly, the number that might be available to work on a venture is 30, 40, or 50 at the most, right? The rest is going to be involved in, just making a living, doing a local job, running the auto repair business, or working on the farm, or doing the laundry, et cetera. So we by no means assume that the limit of a Game B venture is, any given proto B. It's basically all of Game B plus whatever we want to bring in from Game A. Mm-hmm. So we're prepared to take on any problem of any size, but but not right now.
So I want to talk to you a little bit then about some hangers-on or hangovers that might come along from Game A, including just sort of the massive systems in Game A that may want to disrupt certain aspects of Game B, and that is predators. You're not a real metaphysics guy, but malevolence makes itself known in human nature, and given our evolutionary variation, there are humans that are more optimized to, let's say, parasitize other humans than others.
Absolutely. We have the big Game B issues, sociopathy.
So
what
how
do we do about the sociopaths?
Yeah,
right?
How do you deal with predators?
You kill them. We have talked about this literally from the first conversation that we had about Game B, which we are not naive. We have evolutionary biologists as part of this, two pretty top evolutionary biologists as part of the startup team for the Emancipation Party and Game B. And so we're well aware that predation is inevitable, and we just have to be prepared to deal with it. All right. In terms of economic predation, we have to outcompete them, literally, right? When they start to, raise the stakes of political predation, that becomes trickier. And that's where being in a place like the United States is better than being in some place where the strength of the state is stronger. The U.S. state has gotten a lot stronger than it used to be and a lot stronger than it should be. But there's still an awful lot of room to do your own thing so long as you don't violate the law. As I like to point out to people, in the Anglo-Saxon world, and particularly in the United States, Canada, and Australia, that which is not forbidden is permitted. In like the EU and in the civil law legal code that was inherited from the Romans and then was updated by Justinian, who was Greek Orthodox in Constantinople. Well, actually, I think he was still a Catholic, but Constantinople, Eastern Empire, and then it was redone again by Napoleon. Basically, the rules are only that which is permitted. So at least in the Anglo-Saxon sphere, if we're careful, we have a good opportunity to avoid political predation. Comes to physical predation, I'm kind of a hard-nosed old redneck, right? And I'm perfectly prepared to say proto-bees will probably have militias, right? And if it comes to it, we're going to have to fight it out, God damn it.
Yeah. Well, so that works then on the level of small communities and individual conflict that might arise. What do you do about the nation states, right? So you've got the U.S., but you've got places like China, which is sort of like China's almost become like a hyper version of Game A in some sense, because it's sort of pursuing a kind of growth trajectory, a kind of capital accumulation at all costs. And it's also extraordinarily centralized. In fact, it's making, now that it's under single person leadership, it's making strides to become even more centralized. And it's using all of the technological capacity that it has at its disposal to, essentially try to create a large prison that it thinks that no one will ever be able to get out of. How do you think about the geopolitical implications of this and the propensity for a Game A type state to outcompete a state that's more concerned, because I just imagine, like, if you take the Anglo-Saxon world, the United States, let's say it's sort of the free countries, as the places where Game B will be able to flourish, how do you stop a place like, let's just use China as the bad guy, even though there's different angles you can take on that. How do you stop a place like that from just sort of coming in and trying to impose its system or its style by force?
Obviously, we'll have to have counterforce, right?
Yes.
Again, we're not hippies in a mud hut, and we're not naive. And how that would work out, I'm not sure. But to answer one of the things you did not ask is, we're, again, not naive. We don't think we're going to build Game B in China anytime soon, right? In the same way Gandhi famously said his method of nonviolence would not have worked in Nazi Germany, that allowed India to get out from colonial oppression by the Brits. And so you have to be realistic on where you practice game B. And so we see the West as the first place. We think that areas that are, say, under-organized in some ways, like sub-Saharan Africa might be another opportunity. Latin America could be another opportunity. Latin America is really part of the West. It's just a laggard part of the West. It has its issues. But no, China or Russia today, don't think so. To the question of should the Chinese decide they're going to try to roll over the Anglosphere, well, the Anglosphere's always got to be ready to fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're definitely not timid in any sense about self-defense, even though I can't imagine Game B ever, choosing to go to war. Maybe that will become an inevitability in some scenario.
Well, I hope not. There's nothing more wasteful than war. The worst invention of the human race is war. On the other hand, at our current level of personal development, it's still a possibility. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, on the third hand, it's quite amazing that the idea that the Germans and the English and the French could get into it again seems exceedingly unlikely. And yet for hundreds of years, that was the main agenda of European geopolitics, was some balance of power between Austria and Germany and France and England and Spain and sometimes Italy, with constant wars, right? But that's pretty much unthinkable today. Maybe we get to a point with that on a global basis. And maybe, what will China do? I'm with you, frankly. I do not like what China is doing. I refer to them as neo-fascists, which is kind of ironic considering they think of themselves as communists. But in reality, they're a combination of the state plus capitalism plus nationalism and militarism, with a heavy-duty police state that's getting more heavy-duty every day. So they fit the model of fascism better than they do communism. On the other hand, historically, the Chinese have not been imperialists, right? They want to defend themselves, but they have not gone very far afield. They've conquered Vietnam a couple of times, and then the Vietnamese have revolted and thrown them the hell out. There's been border skirmishes around Korea, and Tibet, you can argue. But China does not have a tradition of long-range conquest. So the Chinese want to be Chinese and be assholes. That's their business in China. For the foreseeable future, but they come, and let's be optimistic and say that Game B gets to the point that it replaces the nation state in the West. 800 million, 1 billion people. We will not be naive. We know we will still have to be able to fight if we need to against other nation state level or groups. At least, again, that's me. I'm a fairly cantankerous person. I'm a gun nut. I got at least 100 guns. I don't know how many exactly. Actually, I sold a few couple of years ago. Probably less than 100. But anyway, I'm a great believer in Second Amendment. I'm a great believer in the fact that, if you're not prepared to defend yourself, someone's going to take your shit, right? And that has to be true at every scale, including the civilizational scale.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little bit of a cultural mutt myself. I'm half Jewish, but also raised here in the Midwest. I'm from Michigan, and sort of a rural, more or less type area, and so I have a lot of different, cultural influences with regards to things like gun rights and even social political issues. I wanted to ask you. So I listened to a conversation that you had on the podcast Team Human with a professor from City University of New York, who was really continuing to push you on certain. He's trying to sort of steer the direction in very racial directions. Concerns about social justice, concerns about minority rights, etc. And I think one of the objections that some people might have in today's culture to your conceptualization of Game B, which I think can get mischaracterized as kind of utopian, is that there could be, for example, ethnic strife. As I told you, I'm half Jewish, so rising crimes against Jews, which is happening unfortunately in the United States right now, is something that is on my radar and that I'm concerned about. I don't have any concerns about it happening in my particular community, but I know of cities and areas of the country where it is happening. How do you think about ethnic strife? This is very similar to the question earlier about not only about predation, but also about status. It sort of seems to be built into human beings at some level that when you get to certain levels of heterogeneity, you get sort of ethnic strife. Do you think that's more of an issue of just assimilation, having a sort of shared cultural understanding? How do you think about those issues?
Very good question. But also, before I answer that one, let me first, you said people might mistake Game B for utopian. We want to be very clear. We are anti-utopian. Utopians claim they have the magic formula in their little book, and if you just follow our instructions, everything will be great, right? Marx is a perfect example of that. Hitler, Mao, all these people, these were utopians. We are very radically empiricists and experimentalists, and believe that we can have some principles, but by the way, we have to be able to amend our principles if they don't turn out to be correct, and probably some of them are wrong, just like the U.S. Constitution has an amendment process built into it. Game B must be able to self-modify its own code, to use kind of computer science terminology, and so we are anti-utopian. In fact, in the Game B world, utopian is an insult. For the record.
I thought it might be, so I'm glad you clarified.
Yeah, that's a very important point, because some people say, oh, those goddamn hippie utopians. Well, that's not us. Into ethnic, racial, religious strife. I think this is some of the stupidest shit in the world, really. If you know anything about human biology, you know that humans aren't very different at the level of their biology, and that the fact that we have allowed ourselves to be divided and set upon each other, over the last, there's a question about how far back this goes. The current model of the races of the world is probably only 500 years old, right?
Yeah.
The Romans and the Greeks actually didn't give a shit about race. What they gave a shit about was language, right, and ethnicity. To the Greeks, a barbarian was a person who did not speak Greek. You could be a black person from sub-Saharan Africa or someone from China, and there are documented cases of this, who got adopted into Greek families, learned to speak Greek, fully accept, didn't give two shits about race, right? Romans were very similar. They were proud of their Roman ethnicity, but very interesting. What did the Romans do? How did they conquer the world? Is that they extended their Roman citizenship to everybody they conquered. It started out that you had to be in the city of Rome to be a Roman. And then they had a big civil war with the Italians in south central Italy that they had conquered, but had not assimilated. And I forget who it was. One of the great Roman leaders said, here's the answer. Let's offer these rebellious Italian tribes full Roman citizenship, right? And full the ability to vote for consul, the whole deal, right? And that settled it, right? And after that, eventually, even people in Gaul and all that were, where France is today, they were Roman citizens. Paul of Tarsus, the Saul of Tarsus, when he was a Jew, hated Christianity, and then supposedly he got struck by lightning on the road to Damascus and became, the aluminum siding salesman of Christianity, right? He was a Roman citizen. And that's why he wasn't crucified, because you could not crucify a Roman citizen. He was executed some other way. I don't know, chopped his head off, I think, actually, is what it was. I personally, I'm not going to speak for Game B on this, because it's such a sensitive topic these days, that all this huffing and puffing about ethnicity and religion and race is classic Game A malware, and that we do not intend to replicate it in Game B at all. We are a big tent in Game B, but one thing we have explicitly ruled out, I'm going to pull it up and I'm going to read it because it's so important. We have ruled out racists and anti-Semites by name as not welcome in Game B. And that applies to all varieties, including this neo-racism called wokeism, right?
Yeah.
At least the first. This is kind of a weird thing. There's a lot of people say they're woke, And what that basically means is that they believe that we haven't done enough to fully bring some of the marginalized groups fully to the table of American life. I 100% agree with that. But then there's other people, I call them wokies to distinguish it from wokes, who believe this critical race theory nonsense, right? Which is essentially racism, right? It says that we are who our race is, when that's exactly what we have to get away from. So anyway, the one thing where we get real specific and close the Big Ten, Game B will not tolerate ideologies that target and limit individuals based on race, creed, color, gender, sexual orientation, or neurodiversity. Individuals belonging to all categories are to be treated fairly and held to the same responsibilities regarding their own development towards increasing sovereignty. And then the headline is racist and anti-Semites are not welcome in this group. And so I know people think this is naive, and I've gotten into arguments with people about this. But I say, frankly, it's a game A problem. In game B, we're just not going to play that shit. We are going to be aware that this is just garbage that is spun up for various reasons, and it's not meaningful, and that each person should be evaluated on the content of their character. What a concept.
Yeah, well, it's interesting there. You have a conception of rights that's sort of baked into that statement that I think also applies from your other utterances that I've heard to game B more generally, which is actually more classical conception of natural right than the sort of modern one that we've inherited. Our modern conception of natural right has more to do with sort of a Hobbesian view of self-preservation at all costs. When you say that you're willing to kill these predators, and when you also state that something like you'll belong to this game B community regardless of your individual characteristics, but that comes along with it an attendant set of responsibilities, that itself is also a classic understanding of natural right. In classical Greek society, your rights as a citizen had attendant duties attached to them, and also human flourishing was the reason for having them. They weren't just rights that you had for the sake of you being a human or you being in some sort of abstract social contract like we have here in the United States under our Constitution. The rights were justified not on a metaphysical basis, like a lot of people like to claim that they came from Judaism or Christianity, but they were originally about how do you push the community. Now they were more focused on group cohesion, but how do you push the community towards excellence? And so that
virtue ethics, right? I can't. I'm not going to speak for the whole game community, but I will say that some of the oldest gangsters of game B are big time into virtue ethics, right? And not into deontological ethics. That's the the metaphysical argument that it must be true that X is the ethical thing, right? Or utilitarianism, Hume's idea of sort of just ultimate transactional money grubbing, essentially, or hedonism. It's all about evolving a group of definitions of what is good character that we believe will cause a society to flourish. And it didn't come down from, that's why we joke actually on the Game B homepage and the Game B site. The rules actually have a picture of Moses's tablets, and has the 10 commandments, right, which are 10 rules of which I just read you one of them. And we do that ironically because we say specifically, this shit was not brought down from Mount Sinai on a stone tablet. This is stuff humans invented, right? And we've done it by trial and error. And we have a fairly good idea about what attributes of character result in good societies. Now, we're not going to be dictatorial about it. If one Game B group wants to, let's say prudence is one of the 7 classic virtues. Wants to de-emphasize prudence, for instance. They want to be more like hippies in mud huts. Well, give it a try, see if it works. My bet is it won't, right? You want to dispense with honesty and good faith? Well, I'm going to tell you that ain't going to work, right? You want to dispense with organizing a society with one of its principal priorities around the well-being of families and children, I'm going to tell you that's not going to work long haul, right? But if you want to try it, go right ahead. So I think you've hit on this, which is that there's a very strong virtue ethics thread in Game B.
Okay. Last question here before I let you go, because we are nearing the end of our time together. You laid out in that Medium article that you referenced various stages for how you think Game B might go. And now I want to be clear, you're not at all prescriptivist about this and saying that this is the way that it has to go, or this is the way that every Game B scenario or community will evolve. But they roughly involve something like proto Game B, which I would say is more or less what we're doing now.
Pre-Game B is where we are today. Yeah, pre-Game B is first, and that is getting ourselves ready to get to the next step, which is Proto B. And Proto B are these first settlements we're talking about, and also closely related Game B ventures. I sort of just hand waved as I went by in that essay. If I was going to rewrite that essay, I would put Game B ventures equal to Proto Bs at the coming stage, which we're about to enter. But most people will still be in pre-B for quite a long while, and which means that they will be not strongly affiliated with a live entity of lots of Game B people doing actual things. And we, in that article, I put quite a list of things that people should be working on, right? They should be working on their sovereignty, which we define quite specifically as basically learning to act like an adult person, not a sniveling little shit, right? Learn some real skills, learn how to fix a car, learn how to butcher meat, learn how to cook, learn how to bake, learn how to brew, learn how to make a computer out of electromechanical relays, maybe. Who knows, right? Learn some actual practical shit.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, it does, right? Get your financial house in order. I specifically called out in that essay. Pay your debts down. Start reducing your lifestyle spend. Get away from your goddamn Mercedes, right? Get all that shit out of your life. Get healthy to some degree. I'm not the greatest role model for that one. Oh well, right? But there's a long list of things in the pre-B world, and of course, start to interact with other people around some of these other domains. Like in the online world today, we have groups for Game B parenting. We have groups for Game B governance. We have groups for increasing your sovereignty, etc. Join up with some of those groups and work with others to help improve yourself, and you can help other people improve themselves in this pre-B world. And for a long time, probably at least 90% of Game B players will be in pre-B. But then as we start getting Proto Bs and Game B ventures, then there'll be hot spots of Game Bism, which people who are gotten themselves ready can join up to, right? Yeah. And then those things will intentionally parasitize Game A to be able to mobilize new resources to continue to grow more Game B ventures and more Proto Bs, and gradually seduce away the best and the brightest from Game A over 80-year period or thereabouts. And at some point, we may reach a sufficient concentration in some area currently dominated by a nation state that we might actually see a phase change to a Game B sovereign entity on the ground. I doubt it looks like the current nation state. That will have some attributes of it, particularly in the around areas of defense. It's more likely to be much more pluralistic. One of the things about Game B is we call it coherent pluralism. A kernel, and then outside the kernel, people can pretty much do what you want. A Hasidic Jewish Proto B, go right ahead, right? Perfectly reasonable if you want to do that. And so that's essentially how we see it. And then eventually, several nation state like territories, big enough area, maybe there becomes a superorganism that might use something like liquid democracy. I think liquid democracy, I've got a good introductory article called Introduction to Liquid Democracy on Medium, is probably good for groups of a few 100,000 and up. I don't think necessarily small communities is its forte. And then something like that allows a non-rigid, non-hierarchical way of self-governance at scale might be the answer for how Game B comes to replace the nation state. But no guarantees on that. As I warned in that article, this shit hasn't been tried at scale, so be careful.
Yeah, well, so we're all in the early stages of this, and you've got time. But I think the key takeaway here is that every individual has it on themselves to get prepared if this is something that they're interested in moving into.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You sort of move through the stages there that I was going to ask you about, which is find the others online and find the others IRL. I think I'm sort of in the stage of finding the others online. That's part of why I actually started this podcast in the first place. And hopefully I'll be finding the others IRL in the near to medium future once I get more of my my life situations in order.
Yeah, and frankly, the COVID has pushed the IRL part out a little bit,
accelerating it.
Yeah, and I think the rebound out of COVID, we're going to see a tremendous interest in doing Game B in towns everywhere. Monthly initially, then maybe weekly meetups for potluck dinners, and let's talk about sovereignty this week. Let's talk about coherence next week. Let's talk about virtue ethics the week after that. And I think that's going to be an important part because again, as we've talked about in the very beginning, this idea that the online is great because it's cheap, it's widespread. When there's only a few of us, it's a good way for us to connect. But the links are fairly weak. When you augment that, and I do believe augment, both are valuable with in real life, face-to-face community building, I think you're going to see some magic occur that no one's ever seen before, which is the combination of on-the-ground strong links and powerful and well-thought-through virtual links. And the combination of the two is going to be much more powerful than either by itself.
And I can't wait to see what's going to come. Well, thank you, Jim. This has been an absolute pleasure. I appreciate you giving us your time today to talk about Game B. I think the links that we all mentioned are where can people find you, Jim? Tell the people.
You can find me at jimruttshow.com if you want to find my podcast. You can find the others at the Game B home website, game-b.org. If you want to just browse through a pile of unorganized stuff, which has a tremendous amount of the history of Game B in it, gameb.wiki is a good place to look. There's also a Facebook group that we're de-emphasizing that, but if you just want to connect up, just search Game B, GAMEB, on Facebook, and there's a Facebook group, got a few thousand members on it, fairly active. And use the hashtag GameB on Twitter, and maybe you'll find some people. So those are some of the places to find the others, and that's in some sense the first part of the journey.
Well, thank you so much.
And also, don't forget a journey to Game B on Medium, probably the single most coherent source, not as coherent as I like it to be, and I'm working on something to replace it, but a good place to start to make sense out of all this stuff. I know it's a rather large jump from Game A thinking, and people, find it mentally stressful to kind of picture all this crazy shit. But it's not as crazy as it sounds. If you dig into it, I think you'll see that it makes some sense.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. And it was, as I said, an absolute pleasure. And I hope that we'll be able to maybe one day meet in person sooner rather than later.
Yeah, sounds great. And thanks, Alex. These were great questions. You obviously did your homework. I'm always impressed by podcasters that have done their work so they can ask good questions, and you certainly did a great job there.
Awesome.